There are a million ways to catch a walleye, whether you're pulling cranks, pulling blades, jigging, you name it. So to help break things down for guys like you and me, I asked Joel Nelson to explain when he uses what bait and in what situation. Enjoy. When do you bust out the jigging wraps?
You know, jigging wraps, being a vertical presentation and the fact that they're so heavy, they fish really well deep. So if I've got deep water and walleye situations and they're off the bottom and they look aggressive, I can count on those fish to be visual eaters, on the prowl, ready to hunt. So that's when I think 20 plus feet of water and really aggressive fish off the bottom. And if you're trophy hunting, big arcs, that's a jigging wrap situation all day.
When do you cast crankbaits?
You know, casting crankbaits, something I've done on the river for a lot of years, Lake Pepin area. It's something that I'm counting on a big wind. I don't tend to cast crankbaits unless I know I've had consistent wind out of the same direction, better than 10 miles an hour, maybe 15 miles an hour, gusting even higher for a period of time to really get those shallow fish going. I love fishing shallow fish. Shallow fish are up there eating. They're there for a reason. And crankbaits are the perfect way. Put the wind at your back, start hooking at the shoreline, and that's the key situation I'm looking for to fish crankbaits.
When do you troll crankbaits?
Trolling is a great strategy for finding fish first and foremost, right? If you're fishing in a new situation, new body of water, you've never fished before, putting more baits in front of more fish a lot of times simply means more fish caught. So trolling is something I use to find fish first and foremost. Second of all, I troll crankbaits quite often when fish are scattered. Large structural elements, long runs of contiguous contour depth levels. If I've got a big sand break that's 18 to 22 feet, pretty consistent over a half a mile or more, crankbaits are the ultimate solution. Put down lead core, you're trolling at a pretty consistent depth, covering a lot of ground, and if I'm seeing pods of fish scattered over distance, that's where trolling comes into play for me.
What is the ideal situation for jigs?
Jigs is a different situation altogether. With jigs, I'm looking for pods of schooled fish. I think of a jig as a really precision-based extraction method. I mean, it's something where I'm seeing fish tightly balled on a structural element. I feel that if I can get right over the top of those fish, drop right back by the transducer, I feel like I've got a really good chance of catching those fish because literally they can't ignore it. Yeah, I'm in the fish. So I'm looking for pods of fish on smaller structural elements before I break out the jigs.
When would you use a live bait rig?
I actually prefer live bait rigging. Rigging for whatever reason, I don't know what it is. I feel like I have an advantage in that I feel like I can focus, watch the rod tip, pay attention to the dynamics. I really like pulling on rig fish where I've got maybe pods of fish that are moving a little bit. It's not a tiny structural element, maybe it's something a little bit larger, and fish are still potted up in groups, but they're a little more distributed across this area. Maybe it's a mud flat, maybe it's a rock pile with an inside turn. I like rigging on fish just as much as I do jigging, but I feel with rigging, you can cover a little more ground because you're going maybe 0.5 miles an hour, so maybe call that a moderate to slow tactic, whereas jigging, you're focused right on top of those single pod of fish. So that's kind of how I break it up.
When do you like to use spinner rigs?
Pulling spinners is awesome when you've got all kinds of stuff in the water column. I'm seeing bugs, I'm seeing bait, I'm seeing walleyes, and everything's kind of mishmashed in throughout you know, the bottom 2 feet of the water column. The cool part about pulling spinner rigs is that you can cover some ground, but you can also slow down a little bit and pull on real tight specific groups if you've got them. So I call that more of a moderate speed tactic, somewhere in between rigging and trolling crankbaits, that I can still cover a little bit more ground, yet not be focused on an individual spot situation.
When do you like to use blade baits?
So blade baits, I fished a lot back in the day. In fact, blades, I fished them through the ice. I fished them in the river a lot. I really like blade baits, and I fish blade baits a lot like a jig. And especially in walleye river current situations, they're great because they're heavy. You can fish them like a jig and maintain good bottom contact and sand and other areas like that. And in murky water situations, they kick out a ton of vibrations. So it's this weird hybrid between a jig and a crankbait that does a lot of the things that both baits do really well, and walleyes love them.
When do you like to use hair jigs for walleyes?
Hair jigs. I have not been a part of the hair jig craze that's really kind of taken over. That's about to change. I need to spend some more time reinvesting efforts into hair jigs because I used to fish them all the time. I used to fish them vertically, sometimes with bait, sometimes not, for walleyes and river situations, and then casting them shallow, just like you would with crankbaits. So often on those windblown days where we're casting rocky windblown shorelines, if the wind backs off a little bit, hair jigs are the perfect antidote because you can adjust your weight, and when those fish aren't up real shallow crashing on crankbaits, they'll just settle to the next break off. They're still there. You just need to fish them a little more deep and methodical, and that's where hair jigs have been wonderful on the river for me in the past. So I need to invest some time into getting good at that again.
Do you ever use spoons in open water?
I gotta say I don't think I've ever used spoons in open water for walleyes intentionally. That said, when I was a kid, trolling spoons for pike or whatever, just trying to catch fish, caught a lot of walleyes on spoons. I don't know why it hasn't really clicked for me personally, but no, I'm not the kind of guy that invests a lot of time in that. But again, one of those techniques that you look at your angling resume and what you do and how you do it, that would be a great one to spend some time learning a little bit more just as well.
When do you use plastic versus live bait?
I'm a big fan of plastics. I'll use plastics whenever I can get away with it. I think in the early part of the season, live bait, for the most part, my experience is that it's been preferential. It's been better when water temps are 55, maybe even 60 degrees and below. But once you hit higher water temps, plastics are the ultimate. They're awesome because obviously you don't need to keep going through bait again and again and again. The cool part with warmer water temps is you can fish your baits a little more aggressively, a little more quickly. You can cast, bring them in, and keep them moving, and that promotes the ultimate action on plastics. So for me, plastics are all about once the water temp hits a certain degree range, and for the rest of the summer, plastics are usually my first try, and if they don't work, then I'll go to live bait.
When do you bust out the lipless crankbaits?
You know, lipless crankbaits to me are a riff on blade baits. People would disagree with me. Obviously they're shaped different, they're a little bit different. The cool part about lipless crankbaits is obviously the rattle. A lot of the vibration comes from that shimmy shake as it's pulled upward just like a blade bait would. But I think of rip and wrap situations for big trophy fish applications, specifically in water that is a little bit murky, a little bit stained. Those rattles really help fish seek that bait out. And I tell you, if there's one application that I can think of where rip and wraps and similar hard-bodied, lipless crankbaits apply, is stained water, big fish. It's a go-to.
When do you use swim baits?
To tell you the truth, I don't fish swim baits a ton. When I do fish swim baits, it's when I'm casting shallower, and a crankbait would work as well. And it's a great search bait from that standpoint. Crankbaits are gonna dive down to a specific depth. The cool part about a swim bait is you can fish at any depth you want. But I've had actually the best success slow rolling them, just reeling like you would a crankbait. So, but if you need depth control, fishing a steeper break, you want it shallower on the top end and deeper on the bottom, or maybe you want to slow roll it, just 10 feet below the surface, that's where swim baits are awesome because you have the ultimate in depth control.